The Mustang's wild eyes met hers across the corral, and in that moment of connection, Sarah knew the stallion would trust her before the sun set on another day, though every rancher in Montana Territory said she was wasting her time on an animal that could never be broken. Sarah Whitmore had arrived in the wildlands south of Helena in the spring of 1882, bringing with her methods that most men dismissed as fool's fancy. At 22 years old, she possessed a patience that seemed unnatural to the hardened cowboys and ranchers who populated this untamed corner of Montana Territory. The land here rolled in waves of golden grass, broken by rocky outcroppings and stands of pine that darkened the hillsides. The mountains rose in the distance like sentinels, their peaks still capped with snow even as summer approached. Her father's ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres purchased with money he had earned building railroads back east. Thomas Whitmore had moved his daughter here after his wife's death, hoping the clean air and endless horizons would heal both their hearts. He had given Sarah free rein to pursue her unusual passion for working with wild horses, though he did not fully understand her methods. Most ranchers broke horses through force and dominance, roping them, tying them down, and riding them until their spirits cracked. Sarah had watched such breaking sessions and felt sick at the sight of terrified animals fighting against ropes and saddles. She worked differently. The corral she had built sat away from the main ranch buildings, a large circular pen constructed of sturdy lodgepole pine. Inside that space, she would spend hours with captured Mustangs, simply being present with them. She never rushed. She never forced. She waited for the horses to come to her, drawn by curiosity and the calm energy she projected. The black stallion currently in her corral had been captured 3 days ago by a crew of her father's ranch hands. They had driven a small band of wild horses down from the high country, separating out this magnificent male for Sarah's work. He stood 16 hands high, his coat the color of midnight, his mane tangled with burrs and prairie grass. A white star marked his forehead, the only break in all that darkness. Sarah stood in the center of the corral, her boots planted firmly in the dust. She wore practical clothing, a split riding skirt of dark wool, a cotton blouse, and a leather vest that had belonged to her mother. Her hair, the color of honey, was braided down her back. She held no rope, no whip, nothing but her own stillness. The stallion circled the perimeter, never taking his eyes from her. His nostrils flared, testing her scent on the wind. "I am not here to hurt you," she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the space between them. "I am here to understand you." The stallion snorted and tossed his head, but his ears swiveled forward, listening. Time passed differently when Sarah worked. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the corral with summer intensity. Sweat dampened her collar, but she did not move from her position. The stallion continued his circling, gradually slowing. His initial panic had faded, replaced by wary assessment. She could see the intelligence in his eyes, the careful consideration. When he finally stopped moving, standing at the far side of the corral with his head high and alert, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. This was progress. She slowly lowered herself to sit cross-legged in the dust, making herself smaller, less threatening. The stallion watched this movement with intense focus. She began to hum, a tune her mother had sung when Sarah was a child. The melody drifted across the corral, gentle and repetitive. The stallion's ears flicked back and forth. He took one step toward her, then stopped. His muscles quivered with uncertainty, caught between the instinct to flee and the growing curiosity about this strange human who made no demands. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. Sarah glanced toward the gate, frustration flickering through her. She had asked not to be disturbed during her sessions. The stallion retreated to the far fence, his momentary interest replaced by renewed suspicion. A man dismounted outside the corral, looping his horse's reins over the fence post. Sarah had never seen him before, and she would have remembered if she had. He stood well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that spoke of hard physical labor. His clothing marked him as a working cowboy: worn denim pants, scuffed leather boots, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a brown hat that had seen better days. Dark hair curled at his collar, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention as he approached the fence. They were an unusual shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over distant mountains, and they watched her with an intensity that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "You're scaring my horse," Sarah called out, not bothering to hide her irritation as she stood up. The man leaned against the fence, folding his arms across the top rail. "Did not mean to interrupt," he said. His voice was deep, with a slight roughness that suggested he did not waste words on unnecessary talk. "Your father said I might find you here." "My father sent you?" "In a manner of speaking. I am looking for work, and he said his daughter handles the horse training. I needed to see that for myself before I signed on." Sarah walked toward the fence, conscious of the stallion's eyes following her movement. "And what did you see?" "A woman sitting in the dust while a wild horse stands on the other side of the pen." He said it without mockery, but the skepticism was clear in his tone. "Then you did not see very much at all." Sarah reached the fence, stopping a few feet from where he stood. Up close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, marks left by years of squinting into the sun. He was perhaps 28 or 30, she guessed, with the weathered look of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors. "What is your name?" "James Harding. People call me James." "Well, James Harding, if you want to work on this ranch, you will need to understand that we do things differently here, at least when it comes to the horses. Your father mentioned you have some unusual methods." James shifted his weight, his eyes moving past her to study the stallion. "That black has been wild his whole life. He will kill you if he gets the chance." "He will not." "You sound mighty certain." "I am." Sarah met his gaze directly. Horses are not naturally aggressive toward humans. They are prey animals. Their instinct is to run, not to fight. If a horse attacks, it is because he has been cornered, threatened, or hurt. That stallion has no reason to hurt me because I have given him no reason to fear me. James considered this, his expression unreadable. "And you think you can train him without breaking his spirit?" "I do not want to break anything about him. I want to earn his trust, so he chooses to work with me." Horses do not choose. They follow the strongest leader. Sarah felt her frustration building. She had heard these arguments before from countless cowboys who thought they understood horses because they could ride them into submission. Strength has many forms. The strongest leader is not always the one with the heaviest hand. Something flickered in James's eyes, an emotion she could not quite name. Interest, perhaps, or challenge. "Teach me your way," he said suddenly. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah blinked, surprised. "What?" "If I am going to work here, I should understand your methods. Teach me how you do this." He gestured toward the corral, toward the stallion who watched them both with suspicion. "You want to learn patience and trust?" Sarah could not keep the skepticism from her own voice now. "I want to learn what works. I have been training horses for 12 years, and I have seen a lot of broken animals and broken men. If you have a better way, I want to know it." Sarah studied him carefully, looking for signs of mockery or insincerity. She found none. His expression was serious, those storm cloud eyes steady on hers. "It takes time," she warned. "Days, sometimes weeks with a single horse. It is not quick, and it is not always exciting to watch." "I have time. And you have to truly believe in it. You cannot fake patience. Horses know." "Then I will learn to believe." James straightened, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "When do we start?" Sarah glanced back at the stallion. The horse had relaxed slightly during their conversation, his head lowered, one hind leg cocked in a resting position. She had lost today's momentum, but there would be tomorrow. "Meet me here at dawn," she said. "And James, leave your rope and your whip in the barn. You will not need them." He nodded slowly, settling his hat back on his head. "Dawn it is, Miss Whitmore. Sarah, if we are going to work together, you should call me Sarah." Sarah. The name sounded different in his voice, softer somehow. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked back to his horse. Sarah watched him mount with the easy grace of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than on his feet. He rode away toward the main ranch buildings, leaving her alone with the stallion and a strange flutter of anticipation she could not quite explain. The next morning arrived cool and clear, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold as the sun crept above the eastern horizon. Sarah reached the corral to find James already there, sitting on the top rail of the fence watching the stallion. Oh, he had shaved, she noticed, revealing a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it did not smile often. He wore a clean shirt, dark green this time, and had apparently taken her instructions to heart because she saw no coiled rope hanging from his belt, no whip in his hand. "You are early," she said as she approached. "Old habit. My father used to say the early man gets the best of the day." "Wise man." "Stubborn man," James corrected, but there was affection in his voice. He ranched up in Wyoming territory until the winter of '78 wiped him out. Lost everything. Sarah heard the weight in those words. The story he was not telling. The winter of 1878 had been devastating across the northern plains, with temperatures dropping so low that cattle froze standing up, and snow piled in drifts higher than a man's head. Many ranchers had lost their herds, their fortunes, their futures. "I am sorry," she said quietly. James shrugged, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. "It was a long time ago. He recovered, started over with a smaller place. He is still there, stubborn as ever." "And you left?" "I needed to see what else was out there. I've worked ranches from Colorado to the Canadian border, learning what I could from each place." He looked at her directly. "Never seen anything like what you're doing, though." Sarah unlatched the corral gate, slipping inside. The stallion's head came up immediately, his attention fixed on her. "Come in," she told James, slowly, no sudden movements. James dropped from the fence and entered the corral with careful steps. The stallion snorted, shifting his weight, clearly agitated by the addition of a second human. Sarah raised her hand in a calming gesture. "Stop there," she instructed when James was about 10 feet inside the gate. "Now just stand. Be present but not threatening. Lower your eyes slightly. Direct eye contact is a challenge in horse language." James did as she asked, settling into stillness. Sarah was impressed by how quickly he adapted his body language. Many men struggled with the concept of powerful stillness, confusing inaction with weakness, but James stood with a quiet strength that reminded her of old trees, rooted and unmovable. "What now?" he asked after several minutes had passed. "Now we wait. We let him get used to our presence. We show him that we are not here to chase him or trap him." "How long does this take?" "As long as it takes." Sarah kept her voice soft and even. "This is the hardest part for most people. The waiting, the not doing. But this is where trust begins, in the space where nothing bad happens." They stood together in the corral as the sun climbed higher and the day began to warm. The stallion remained at the far side, but Sarah could see him relaxing by degrees. His ears, which had been pinned back, gradually swiveled forward. His tail, which had been swishing with agitation, hung quiet. His breathing slowed and deepened. "He is calming," James observed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, he is beginning to understand that we are not predators. We are not here to hunt him." "And then what? Once he is calm?" "Then we wait some more." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Patience is not just about waiting, James. It is about waiting without expectation, without imposing our timeline on the process. The stallion will tell us when he is ready for the next step." They stood in silence for a long while. Sarah was acutely aware of James beside her, the solid presence of him, the way he breathed slow and steady, matching the rhythm she had set. She had worked with ranch hands before, tried to teach them her methods, but most had lasted less than an hour before frustration drove them away. James showed no such restlessness. He simply stood, watching, learning. The stallion took a step toward them. Just one step, but it was significant. Sarah felt her heart lift. "Do not react," she murmured to James. "Let him come to us." The horse took another step, then another. His neck stretched forward, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Sarah could see the war happening inside him, instinct battling curiosity. She remained perfectly still, scarcely breathing. Beside her, James had become a statue. The stallion came closer, each step careful and measured. When he was about 15 feet away, he stopped. Sarah could see his muscles bunched and ready to flee at the slightest provocation. Very slowly, she extended her hand, palm down, fingers relaxed. She did not reach toward him, simply offered the gesture, an invitation without pressure. Minutes passed. The stallion stared at her hand as if it were a snake that might strike. Then, with infinite caution, he stretched his neck forward. His nose came closer. Closer. Sarah felt the warm breath from his nostrils touch her fingertips. The contact lasted only a second before the stallion jerked back, but it was enough. It was everything. Sarah lowered her hand slowly, a smile spreading across her face. "Good boy," she said softly. "Such a good, brave boy." The stallion tossed his head as if embarrassed by the praise, but he did not retreat to the far fence. He remained in the middle ground, watching them with what Sarah could only describe as thoughtful interest. "That was remarkable," James said, awe evident in his voice. "That was the beginning." Sarah turned to face him and was struck by the expression on his face. He was looking at her with something like wonder, as if he had just witnessed a miracle. The intensity of his gaze made her stomach flutter strangely. She looked away, suddenly flustered. "We should leave him now. End the session on a positive note. Let him think about what just happened." They walked toward the gate together, moving slowly so as not to startle the stallion. Once outside the corral, James turned to her with questions spilling out. "How did you learn this? Who taught you?" "A horse trader I met when I was 16. He was passing through Pennsylvania where we lived before coming west. He had these beautiful horses, and they followed him like dogs, completely devoted. I asked him how he trained them, and he spent 3 days teaching me the basics. After that, I read everything I could find, studied every method, and developed my own approach." 3 days? And you learned all that? Sarah shook her head. 3 days, and I learned that everything I thought I knew about horses was wrong. The real learning took years. It is still taking years. Every horse teaches me something new. James leaned against the fence, his eyes distant with thought. "I have been doing this all wrong," he said finally. "All these years I thought I was a good horseman, but I have been forcing them to accept me rather than earning their trust. You did what you were taught, what everyone does. It is not your fault." "Maybe not, but now I know better. I cannot go back to the old way, not after seeing that." He looked at her again with those storm cloud eyes. "Will you teach me more? Not just for the ranch work, but because I want to understand this. Really understand it." The earnestness in his voice touched something deep in Sarah's chest. She had spent so much time being dismissed, being patronized by men who thought her methods were silly woman's fancy. To have someone, especially someone with James's experience, ask to learn from her felt like validation she had not realized she craved. "Yes," she said, "I will teach you." Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Sarah and James would meet at the corral before dawn, spending hours with the stallion. James proved to be an exceptional student, absorbing her lessons with focused intensity. He learned to read the subtle signals horses gave, the position of ears, the tension in muscles, the rhythm of breathing. He learned to move with deliberate calm, to project confidence without aggression. Most importantly, he learned to wait. The stallion, whom Sarah had begun calling Shadow for the way he seemed to blend into darkness, responded to their consistent presence. By the fourth day, he was greeting them at the gate, curious rather than fearful. By the end of the first week, Sarah was able to touch his neck, running her hands along his powerful shoulders while he stood quiet and accepting. James watched these interactions with rapt attention, asking questions, taking mental notes. "How do you know when he's ready to accept a halter?" he asked one morning as they watched Shadow graze on the hay Sarah had scattered in the corral. "He will tell me when he is comfortable with my hands all over his body, when he does not flinch at my touch, when he seeks out contact rather than tolerating it. Then I will introduce the halter very slowly, letting him smell it and investigate it before I ever try to put it on him." "And the saddle?" "Weeks away still, maybe months. There is no rushing this." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. They were standing close together at the fence, their shoulders nearly touching. Sarah had become aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with horse training. She noticed how his hands moved when he talked, strong and capable. She noticed the way the morning light caught in his dark hair, revealing hints of auburn. She noticed how her heart beat faster when he smiled, which he was doing more often now. "What are you thinking?" she asked, when the silence had stretched long. "I am thinking that I have learned more in the past week than in the previous 12 years, and I am thinking that you are an extraordinary woman, Sarah Whitmore." Heat rushed to her cheeks. "I am just doing what makes sense to me." "Which is what makes it extraordinary. Most people cannot see past what has always been done. You looked at the old ways and decided there had to be something better. That takes courage." Sarah did not know how to respond to that. She was saved from having to answer by the appearance of her father, walking toward them from the main house. Thomas Whitmore was a tall man in his 50s with silver threading through his brown hair and a beard that was more gray than not. He had kind eyes and a gentle manner, though Sarah knew he could be formidable when crossed. "How is the black progressing, Nourishimir?" he asked as he reached the corral. "Very well. He should be halter trained within a few more days." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Good. We have a buyer coming next month who is interested in well-trained horses. If you can get Shadow ready by then, he will fetch a good price." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "We are selling him?" "That is the business, daughter. We train them, we sell them. You know this?" She did know this. It was the entire purpose of what she did, training wild horses so they could be sold to people who would value them. But the thought of Shadow leaving, of all this careful work being handed over to someone who might not understand or appreciate it, made her chest tight. "I want to make sure he goes to the right person," she said firmly. "Someone who will continue the gentle training, who will not undo everything we have built." "I will make sure the buyer understands," her father promised. "You have my word." He turned to James. "I wanted to talk to you about taking on more responsibility with the regular ranch work. We have a new crew of horses coming in next week from the high country, and I would like you to oversee the capture operation." "Of course, sir. I would be happy to." "Good man." Thomas clapped James on the shoulder. "Sarah has been singing your praises. She says you have taken to her methods like a duck to water." James glanced at Sarah, something warm in his expression. "She is an excellent teacher." After her father left, Sarah felt restless. The idea of Shadow being sold, of him leaving, had unsettled her more than it should have. She knew she could not keep every horse she trained, but this one felt different. Maybe because he was the first horse James had learned with, the first horse that had connected them. "You are worried about him," James said, reading her mood with the same intuitive skill he had developed with horses. "I just want him to have a good life." "He will, because of what you have given him. The trust you have built, the gentleness you have shown him, that will stay with him no matter where he goes. You have changed him, Sarah. Made him into a horse who can live peacefully with humans instead of fearing them. That is a gift." His words eased something in her chest. "When did you become so wise?" "About 4 days ago, when a stubborn woman made me stand in the sun doing nothing and convinced me it was the most important work I had ever done." He smiled, and Sarah felt her heart do that strange flutter again. They stood together in companionable silence, watching Shadow doze in the morning sun. Sarah was intensely aware of James beside her, the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Something was building between them, something that went beyond teacher and student, beyond co-workers. She could feel it in the way his eyes lingered on her face, in the way her skin tingled when they accidentally touched, in the comfortable silences that had developed between them. But she was afraid to name it, afraid to acknowledge what was happening. She had dedicated herself to her horses, to her work. Romance felt like a distraction, a complication she did not need. Yet when James looked at her the way he was looking at her now, with tenderness and admiration and something deeper, she found herself wanting that complication very much. The days continued to unfold in a rhythm of work and learning. True to Sarah's prediction, Shadow accepted the halter within a week, allowing her to slip the soft leather over his head and fasten the buckle without protest. The look of pride on James's face when she walked Shadow around the corral, the stallion following her lead with only gentle pressure on the rope, was worth every hour they had invested. "I have never seen anything like it," James said, shaking his head in amazement. "He's not fighting at all." Because he understands that the halter is not a trap. It is communication, a way for us to talk to each other. Sarah stroked Shadow's neck, and the stallion leaned into her touch, his eyes half closed with pleasure. He trusts us now. That trust is the foundation for everything else. James entered the corral, approaching Shadow slowly. The stallion watched him but showed no alarm. Sarah handed James the lead rope, and he stood there for a moment holding the connection to this wild animal who had chosen to accept him. His hand trembled slightly. "It is all right," Sarah said softly. He knows you. He trusts you too." James began to walk, and Shadow followed. The stallion's steps were calm and measured, his head level, his breathing easy. They completed a full circuit of the corral together, man and horse moving in harmony. When James stopped, Shadow stopped beside him, nudging his shoulder gently. James laughed, the sound surprised and delighted. He reached up to stroke Shadow's face, and the stallion allowed the touch, even seemed to enjoy it. "This is incredible," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, what you have done here, what you have taught me, it is like seeing the world in a completely different way." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. She walked over to stand beside him, her hand coming to rest on Shadow's warm neck. James's hand was there too, and their fingers brushed against each other. Neither of them pulled away. "I am glad you understand," she said quietly. "I am glad you wanted to learn." James turned to face her, his storm cloud eyes intense. "It is not just the horses, Sarah. You have changed how I see everything, how I approach problems, how I think about strength and gentleness, how I move through the world. You have made me want to be a better man." Her breath caught in her throat. They were standing very close now, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, the exact line of his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly as he looked at her. The air between them felt charged, electric, with possibility. "James," she whispered, not sure what she wanted to say, knowing only that something was happening that would change everything. He raised his hand very slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted. When she did not, he gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "Tell me if I am wrong," he said softly. "Tell me if I am the only one feeling this." "You are not wrong," Sarah admitted, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "You are not the only one." James smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face, erasing the weathered hardness and revealing the warm man beneath. "I did not come to Montana looking for this. I came looking for work, for a place to rest a while. But then I saw you in that corral, so patient and brave and absolutely certain of what you were doing, and I knew my life had just changed direction. I felt it too. That first day when you said, "Teach me," I knew you were different. I knew you would understand. I want to understand everything about you, Sarah, not just your methods with horses, but your thoughts, your dreams, what makes you laugh, what makes you cry. I want to know all of it. Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it was born of happiness, not sadness. I want that too. I want to know you, James Harding. I want to understand the man who was brave enough to admit he had been wrong, who was humble enough to learn from a woman half the territory thinks is crazy. Then they are all fools, James said fiercely. You are the sanest person I have ever met, the wisest, the most extraordinary. He leaned down slowly, telegraphing his intention, giving her every chance to refuse. But Sarah did not refuse. She rose on her toes and met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was gentle and searching and full of promise. It tasted like possibility, like the beginning of something that could last a lifetime. Shadow snorted beside them, breaking the moment. They pulled apart, laughing at the horse's impeccable timing. Shadow tossed his head as if pleased with himself for interrupting. Even the horse has opinions, James said, still smiling. He is protective of me, Sarah replied, stroking Shadow's neck. He wants to make sure you are worthy. And am I? Worthy? Sarah looked at him, at this man who had shown up 2 weeks ago as a stranger and had somehow become essential to her days, to her thoughts, to her heart. Yes, she said simply. You are. They spent the rest of the morning working with Shadow, but everything felt different now, charged with new meaning. Every glance held promise. Every accidental touch sparked warmth. They were still learning about horses, but they were also learning about each other, beginning the slow, careful process of building trust between human hearts. Over the following weeks, Sarah and James's relationship deepened alongside their work with the horses. James moved beyond being just a student, becoming a true partner in Sarah's training methods. Her father brought in the new captures from the high country, a band of 6 Mustangs ranging from yearlings to full-grown mares. Sarah and James worked together to gentle them, spending long days in the corrals, demonstrating the patience and consistency that were the cornerstones of their approach. The ranch hands watched with skepticism at first, but even the most doubtful among them could not argue with results. The horses Sarah and James trained were calmer, more responsive, and more willing than those broken by traditional methods. Word began to spread beyond the ranch, and buyers came from as far as Helena and Butte, eager to purchase horses trained by the woman who could tame wild Mustangs with nothing but patience and trust. Thomas Whitmore watched his daughter's success with pride, but he also watched the growing connection between Sarah and James with a father's protective eye. One evening in early July, he invited James to his study after supper. "I want to talk to you about my daughter," Thomas said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey and handing one to James. James accepted the glass but did not drink. "I have the utmost respect for Sarah, sir. I hope you know that." "I do. I have eyes, son. I have seen how you look at her and how she looks at you. I have seen you together in those corrals, working like you share one mind. I have seen her happier in these past weeks than she has been since her mother died." James's expression was cautious. "I care for her deeply, Mr. Whitmore. My intentions are honorable. I believe you, but I need you to understand something about Sarah. She is not like other women. She has a gift, a calling with these horses. She needs someone who will support that, who will not try to make her into something she is not. She needs a partner, not someone who will expect her to give up her work to keep a traditional home." "I know that, sir. It is part of what I love about her. I would never ask her to change or to give up her calling. I want to build a life that supports her dreams, not limits them." Thomas studied him carefully, then nodded. "Good, because if you hurt her, if you disappoint her, you will answer to me. And I may be an old man, but I can still make your life very difficult." James smiled slightly. "Understood, sir. But I promise you I have no intention of hurting her. She is the best thing that has ever happened to me. I want to spend the rest of my life proving I am worthy of her trust." "Then you have my blessing, though I suspect you will still need to ask Sarah herself." "I am working up to that, sir. I want to make sure the timing is right." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "Do not wait too long. Life is uncertain out here. When you find something good, you hold on to it." James took those words to heart. He had been thinking about proposing to Sarah for weeks, but had hesitated, unsure if it was too soon, uncertain if she felt as deeply as he did. But watching her work with the horses the next day, seeing the joy on her face when a young mare took her first steps with a saddle, he knew he could not wait any longer. He loved her with a certainty that went bone deep, and he wanted to build a life with her. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, James asked Sarah to walk with him. They wandered away from the ranch buildings, following a path that led up into the hills. The air was warm and scented with sage and wild roses. Crickets sang in the grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. They reached a spot where the land opened up, providing a view across the valley. The ranch spread below them, buildings small in the vastness of the landscape. The mountains rose in every direction, their peaks turned pink by the setting sun. "It is beautiful here," Sarah said, standing close to James's side. "I never tire of this view." "It is extraordinary," James agreed, "but it is not what I'm looking at." Sarah turned to find him watching her, his expression tender. "James?" He took both her hands in his, holding them gently. "Sarah, I came to Montana Territory without a plan, without any idea of what I was looking for. I was just drifting, taking work where I could find it, never staying long enough to put down roots. And then I met you and everything changed. You changed everything." Sarah's heart was beating so hard she felt dizzy. "You changed me too. You showed me that I was not alone, that someone else could understand what I was trying to do." "I love you," James said, the words simple and direct. "I love your patience, your kindness, your absolute certainty in what you believe. I love the way you talk to horses like they are people deserving of respect. I love your strength and your gentleness and the way you make me want to be better than I am. I love everything about you, and I want to spend my life loving you." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "I love you too. So much it scares me sometimes." James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. In the fading light, Sarah could see it was a ring, simple and beautiful, a silver band with a small turquoise stone. "This belonged to my mother," James said. "It is the only thing of value I own. I know it is not much, but I wanted you to have it. I wanted to ask if you would marry me, if you would let me be your partner in all things, if you would build a life with me here in this wild country." Sarah looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the hope and love shining in his eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, James, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Sarah had never felt so happy, so complete, so certain that she was exactly where she belonged. They were married in August, in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame. James wore his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed, his eyes shining with joy. Thomas Whitmore walked his daughter down the makeshift aisle set up in front of the main house, and when he placed her hand in James's, his eyes were wet with tears. The circuit preacher, who rode through every few months to tend to the spiritual needs of the scattered ranches, performed the ceremony. Sarah and James spoke their vows with voices steady and sure, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. The ranch hands and neighboring families who had gathered cheered when James kissed his bride, and the celebration that followed lasted well into the night. But Sarah's favorite part of the day came later, after the guests had left and the lamps had been extinguished. She and James walked together to the corrals, where Shadow and the other horses dozed in the moonlight. They stood together in the silvery darkness, James's arms wrapped around Sarah from behind, her head resting against his chest. "Are you happy?" James asked softly. "More than I knew I could be," Sarah replied. "Everything I wanted is right here. This place, these horses, and you, especially you. I am the lucky one. I found my home when I found you." They stayed there for a long time, two people who had found in each other the perfect balance of passion and peace, of excitement and contentment. The horses stirred in their pens, sensing the humans nearby, comforted by their presence. It was a moment of perfect harmony, the beginning of a partnership that would shape not just their lives, but the future of horse training across Montana territory. Sarah and James settled into married life with ease, their partnership extending from the corrals into every aspect of their shared existence. Thomas had given them a small house on the property, a sturdy log structure that James spent his evenings improving and expanding. Sarah filled it with touches of home, curtains she sewed herself, wildflowers in mason jars, books about horses and animal behavior that she ordered from back east. Their days developed a rhythm. They rose before dawn, working with the horses through the cool morning hours. As summer gave way to fall, they trained more Mustangs than ever before, the demand for their services growing steadily. Sarah's reputation spread, and visitors came from across the territory to watch her work, to learn her methods, to purchase horses that had been gentled rather than broken. James proved invaluable, not just as a trainer but as a teacher himself. He had a gift for explaining Sarah's methods to skeptical cowboys, translating her intuitive approach into terms that made sense to men who had spent their lives believing that force was the only way to control a horse. Together they began conducting training seminars, inviting ranchers and their hands to spend days at the Whitmore ranch learning the fundamentals of patient horse handling. It was during one of these seminars in late September that trouble arrived in the form of a man named Clayton Morse. He rode into the ranch driving a wagon pulled by two horses that bore clear signs of abuse. Their coats were dull, their ribs showing, and they flinched at every movement Morse made. Sarah felt her stomach turn at the sight. Morse was a large man, thick through the middle, with a red face and small, mean eyes. He climbed down from the wagon and approached Sarah and James where they stood with a group of visiting ranchers. "You the woman who thinks she can train horses by being nice to them?" Morse asked, his tone mocking. Sarah lifted her chin. "I am Sarah Harding. I train horses using patience and trust, yes." "Waste of time if you ask me. A horse needs to know who is boss. Break them hard, break them fast, and they will serve you well enough." "Your horses look like they are serving you very well," Sarah said, unable to keep the edge from her voice as she gestured toward the thin, frightened animals hitched to his wagon. Morse's face darkened. "Those horses do their job. I do not pamper them like they are pets." "There is a difference between pampering and basic kindness," James said, stepping slightly in front of Sarah. "Those animals are underfed and mistreated." "You calling me a poor horseman?" "I am calling you cruel." The air went tense. The other ranchers shifted uncomfortably. Morse took a step toward James, his hands clenching into fists. "You want to back up those words, cowboy?" "Gentlemen, please." Thomas Whitmore appeared from the barn, his voice calm but commanding. "This is private property, and you are disturbing a business event. Mr. Morse, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I came here because I heard you were buying trained horses. I have horses to sell." "Not to me, not in the condition they are in. Take care of your animals, and then perhaps we can do business. Until then, you are not welcome here." Morse looked around at the circle of disapproving faces. He spat in the dust at his feet. "You are all soft. This whole territory is going soft, letting women tell men how to do their business. Mark my words, this foolishness will not last. He stalked back to his wagon, jerking roughly on the reins and causing his horses to stumble in their haste to move. The wagon rumbled out of the ranch, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. "I apologize for that unpleasantness," Thomas said to the assembled ranchers. "Not everyone appreciates progressive methods." "That man should not be allowed to own animals," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "Those horses are suffering." James put a calming hand on her shoulder. "I know, but we cannot save every horse, Sarah. We can only do what we can do." Sarah knew he was right, but it did not ease the sick feeling in her stomach. That night, lying in bed beside James, she could not stop thinking about those thin, frightened horses. "We should have done something," she said into the darkness. "Like what? We cannot steal a man's property no matter how poorly he treats it. The law would not be on our side." "Then the law is wrong." James pulled her closer, his arms strong and comforting around her. "Sometimes the law is wrong. Sometimes all we can do is live by our own principles and hope that eventually enough people will see the right way of doing things that change will come. I want that change to come faster. I know you do. That is one of the many reasons I love you. You have a fierce heart, Sarah Harding, but you cannot fight every battle. You will wear yourself out, and then you will not be able to help anyone." Sarah knew James was right, but that did not make it easier. She had always been driven by a need to help, to fix, to make things better. Seeing suffering she could not alleviate felt like a personal failure. But James's steady presence, his rational voice, helped ground her. She fell asleep in his arms, still troubled but less alone in her trouble. October brought the first real cold. Frost painting the grass white in the mornings and ice forming on water troughs. Sarah and James worked to prepare the horses for winter, ensuring they had adequate shelter and feed. Shadow, who had been sold to a kind rancher from Helena, was thriving in his new home according to reports that reached them. Sarah was pleased but still felt a pang of loss when she thought of the black stallion who had been the foundation of her and James's partnership. They had other horses now, though, including a young paint mare with a sweet disposition and soulful eyes. Sarah had named her Willow for the way she moved, graceful and fluid. Willow had come to them wild and terrified, captured from a band up in the high country, but she had responded beautifully to their gentle handling. By late October, Sarah could ride Willow around the ranch with only a halter and lead rope, no bit or bridle needed. James watched her ride one afternoon, his expression thoughtful. When Sarah dismounted, he said, "You should start teaching other women your methods." "What do you mean?" "I mean there are women all over the territory who are interested in horses but have been told their whole lives that they're not strong enough or tough enough to work with them. You could show them that strength is not just about physical force. You could give them the same gift you have given me." Sarah considered this. "Do you think women would come?" "I think you would be surprised by how many women are hungry for this knowledge, for the chance to do something they have been told is impossible." The idea took root in Sarah's mind. Over the following weeks, she and James discussed how they might structure such a program. They decided to offer a special training session for women the following spring, a 2-week intensive where participants would live on the ranch and learn every aspect of Sarah's methods. When they announced the program, advertising in newspapers across Montana Territory and into Wyoming and Idaho, the response exceeded their wildest expectations. Letters poured in from women of all ages, from ranch wives who wanted to better understand their family's animals, to young women seeking skills that might earn them independence, to widows looking to start new lives. By the time winter settled in hard, they had commitments from 15 women for the spring session. Winter in Montana Territory was harsh and isolating. Snow fell in thick blankets, drifting against the buildings and fences. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid within minutes of being drawn from the well. Sarah and James spent their days caring for the horses, breaking ice on troughs, distributing hay, and ensuring each animal had adequate shelter. The nights were long, and Sarah discovered she was grateful for them. She and James would sit by their fire, planning for spring, reading aloud to each other from books, and talking about their dreams for the future. It was during one of these long winter nights, in late January of 1883, that Sarah realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, the changes in her body subtle but unmistakable. She waited until she was certain before telling James, wanting to give him the news as a gift. They were sitting together after supper, James repairing a bridle while Sarah worked on mending a shirt, when she finally spoke. "James, I have something to tell you." He looked up, immediately attentive to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right. I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." The bridle fell from James's hands. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then pure, radiant joy. "A baby? Sarah, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. I think the baby will come in early August." James crossed to her in 2 long strides, pulling her up from her chair and into his arms. "A baby," he repeated, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to be parents." Sarah laughed, holding him tight. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it. I am amazed. I am grateful. I am terrified. I am all of it at once." He pulled back to look at her face, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Are you frightened?" "A little," Sarah admitted. "But mostly I am excited. I want this baby, James. I want our family." "We will figure it out together," James promised, "just like we figure out everything else, with patience and trust and love." They told Thomas the next day, and the older man's reaction was much like James's had been, shock giving way to overwhelming joy. He pulled Sarah into a tight hug, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother would have been so happy. She always wanted grandchildren." "I wish she could be here," Sarah said softly. "She is here in you, in the way you care for things, in your kindness and strength. You will be a wonderful mother, Sarah." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the rest of the winter and into spring. By the time the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the meadows, Sarah's belly had begun to round noticeably. She felt well, tired sometimes, but not sick, and she continued her work with the horses, though James and her father watched her like hawks, ready to intervene if she showed any sign of strain. The women arrived in April for the training program. They came from all corners of the territory, 15 strong-willed, eager students ready to learn. Sarah, now visibly pregnant, stood before them that first morning and felt a swell of emotion. These women had come because they believed in the possibility of a different way, because they wanted knowledge and skill and independence. She would give them everything she had. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Sarah and James taught from dawn until dusk, demonstrating techniques, supervising practice sessions, answering endless questions. The women threw themselves into the work with enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on reckless. And Sarah found herself having to preach caution more than once. But they learned quickly, these determined women, and by the end of the program, every one of them could approach a nervous horse with the right body language, could earn trust through patience, could read the subtle signs of equine communication. On the last day, as the women prepared to return to their homes and lives, several of them approached Sarah privately. "You have changed my life," one woman said, tears in her eyes. "I thought I was going to spend my whole existence being afraid of the animals on our ranch. Now I feel like I can be a true partner to my husband in the work." Another woman, younger, barely 20, said, "I am going to start my own training business. I am going to show people in my county that women can do this work and do it well. Thank you for showing me it was possible." Sarah hugged each of them, feeling proud and hopeful and deeply grateful. This was why she did this work, not just for the horses, but for the people who could learn to see them differently, to treat them better, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than domination. As spring turned to summer, Sarah's pregnancy advanced. She continued to work, but at a slower pace, spending more time teaching from outside the corrals rather than working directly with the horses. James had become fiercely protective, insisting she rest more, worry less, let him handle the physical demands of the training work. In late July, as the summer heat pressed down on the Montana landscape, Sarah felt the first twinges that signaled her baby's impending arrival. James rode hard into Helena to fetch the doctor, while Sarah's father and the ranch cook, a capable woman named Mrs. Jensen, prepared the house for the birth. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Sarah endured it with the same patient determination she brought to everything else, focusing on her breathing, trusting her body to know what to do. James stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, his face pale with worry. When the baby finally arrived as the sun climbed high on a brilliant August afternoon, Sarah heard the most beautiful sound she had ever known, her son's first cry. The doctor placed the baby in her arms, and Sarah looked down at the tiny, perfect face, the shock of dark hair, the eyes that would eventually be gray-blue like his father's. She felt love crash over her like a wave, so powerful it took her breath away. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." James leaned over them both, his cheeks wet with tears. "He is perfect. Sarah, he is absolutely perfect." "He has your eyes," Sarah said, smiling up at her husband. "And your stubborn chin," James replied, gently touching the baby's face with one finger. They named him Thomas William Harding, after both his grandfathers. Young Thomas was a healthy, strong baby who quickly became the center of life on the ranch. Sarah took to motherhood with the same dedication she brought to her horses, learning to read her son's signals, to understand his needs, to balance patience with decisive action. James proved to be a natural father, tender and attentive, and completely besotted with his son. He would carry the baby out to the corrals in the mornings, talking to him about the horses, about the land, about all the things they would do together as Thomas grew. Sarah would watch them together and feel her heart swell with contentment. This was the life she had wanted without knowing she wanted it, a life rich with purpose and love and family. The years that followed were full and busy. Young Thomas grew from baby to toddler to a sturdy boy who followed his parents everywhere, learning to ride before he could properly walk, developing the same intuitive understanding of horses that his mother possessed. Sarah and James continued their training work, expanding their operation as demand for their services grew. They built additional corrals, hired more hands who were willing to learn and apply their methods, and conducted multiple training programs each year for both men and women. The ranch prospered. Thomas Whitmore, growing older but still active, took great pride in what his daughter and son-in-law had built. He would sit in his rocking chair on the porch in the evenings, watching his grandson play in the yard, and tell anyone who would listen about the woman who trained wild Mustangs with nothing but patience and trust. In 1886, Sarah gave birth to twin daughters, Rose and Lily, who inherited their mother's honey-colored hair and their father's gray-blue eyes. The girls were fierce and fearless from the start, demanding to be included in everything their older brother did. The ranch became even livelier with their presence, filled with laughter and shouting and the constant noise of children who were growing up wild and free. James had never been happier. He would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and just look around at his life, at the children running through the yard, at Sarah working with a horse in the corral, at the mountains rising purple against the sky, and he would feel gratitude so deep it was almost painful. He had found everything he had never known he was searching for in this place, with this woman. Sarah felt the same. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were finally asleep, she and James would walk together through the ranch, checking on the horses, talking about their day, making plans for tomorrow. They would end up at the corral where Shadow had once stood, where they had first begun to learn about each other, and they would remember. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked one night, leaning against the fence. "Staying here, settling down, giving up the wandering life?" James pulled her close, tucking her against his side. Not for one single second. That life was just me looking for this life. I was looking for home, and I found it in you." "I was not looking for anything," Sarah admitted. "I thought I had everything I needed with my horses and my work. But then you asked me to teach you, and suddenly there was this whole other part of life I had never imagined. Best decision I ever made asking you to teach me." "Second best," Sarah corrected with a smile. "The best was when you asked me to marry you." "Fair point." James kissed the top of her head. "Though they are connected. I had to learn your way with horses before I could understand your way with the world. Before I could understand that strength and gentleness are not opposites, they are partners, just like us." The ranch continued to grow and evolve. In 1888, Sarah and James published a small book about their training methods, written during the long winter evenings and printed by a publisher in Helena. The book, titled Patience and Trust: A New Way with Horses, sold steadily throughout the West, bringing their philosophy to people who could never make the journey to Montana to learn in person. Thomas Whitmore passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1889. He had lived to see his daughter happy and successful, to know his grandchildren, to witness the change his family had brought to how people treated horses across the territory. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the ranch, where he could forever watch over the land he had built and the legacy that would continue long after him. Sarah grieved her father deeply, but found comfort in her family and her work. She threw herself into training more horses, teaching more students, writing more articles about her methods for agricultural journals and periodicals. James worried about her taking on too much, but he understood that work was part of how Sarah processed loss, how she honored those who had gone before by continuing to build and create and improve. Young Thomas, now 8 years old, had become an accomplished horseman in his own right. He had his mother's gift with animals and his father's patient temperament. The twins at 3 were already demanding riding lessons and spending every possible moment in the corrals, their small hands fearlessly reaching out to touch horses that towered over them. In 1890, Montana became a state, joining the Union as the 41st state. The wild frontier of Sarah's youth was becoming more settled, more civilized. Railroads crossed the landscape, towns grew larger, and the endless open range began to give way to fenced properties and established ranches. Sarah felt bittersweet about these changes. Progress was good, but something was being lost as well, a certain wildness, a certain freedom. But the horses still needed training, and there was still work to be done. Sarah and James adapted to the changing times, developing new methods for working with draft horses as farms became more mechanized, teaching carriage horses for the growing towns, and always continuing to train the wild Mustangs that still ran free in the high country, though their numbers were fewer every year. In 1892, Sarah gave birth to another son named John after James's father. The baby was welcomed joyously by his older siblings, who immediately took on the roles of protective older brother and sisters. The house was full and noisy and chaotic, and Sarah loved every minute of it, even when she was exhausted and covered in flour or mud or horsehair. James was now in his late 30s, his dark hair showing threads of silver at the temples, his face more lined but still handsome, still capable of making Sarah's heart skip when he smiled at her across a room. They had been married 10 years, and their love had only deepened with time, seasoned by shared work and shared challenges and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful together. One evening in early summer, after the children were finally in bed, Sarah and James sat together on the porch of their home, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. James held Sarah's hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "Do you ever think about that first day," he asked, "when I rode up to your corral and interrupted your work with Shadow?" "All the time," Sarah admitted. "I was so annoyed with you." "I know, you made that very clear." "But also intrigued. There was something about the way you looked at me, like you were really seeing me, not just dismissing me as some eccentric woman playing with horses." "I saw someone extraordinary," James said. "I saw someone who had the courage to do things differently, who trusted her instincts over tradition. I saw someone I wanted to know better, though I did not realize yet that I was seeing the woman I would love for the rest of my life." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. I am so grateful you asked me to teach you. I am grateful for every moment since then. I am grateful you said yes to teaching me, to marrying me, to building this life with me. You have made me better in every possible way. Sarah, you have made me the man I always wanted to be. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear the murmur of the children settling for the night, and from the corrals came the soft sounds of horses shifting and breathing. This was their world, built on patience and trust and love, and it was more than either of them had ever dared to dream. The years continued their steady march. Young Thomas grew into a young man who was every bit as skilled with horses as his mother, perhaps even more so because he had been raised with her methods from birth, never having to unlearn the harsh techniques that had once been standard. The twins became inseparable companions, partners in mischief and adventure, both of them fearless riders who could gentle even the most difficult horses with a combination of their mother's patience and their own unique charm. Little John grew sturdy and strong, quiet but observant, with a gift for reading animal behavior that impressed even Sarah. In 1895, Sarah received an invitation that would change the trajectory of her work in unexpected ways. A university in California was establishing a new program in animal science and had heard of her methods. They wanted her to come and lecture, to demonstrate her techniques, to help establish a curriculum that incorporated humane animal handling into formal agricultural education. Sarah was torn. The opportunity was extraordinary, a validation of everything she had worked for, a chance to influence the next generation of horsemen on a scale she had never imagined. But it would mean leaving the ranch for several months, leaving James and the children, traveling to a place she had never been. James made the decision easy. You have to go, he told her. This is too important to pass up. The children and I will be fine. Your work here can wait a few months, but this chance to spread your methods, to make them part of official teaching, that cannot wait. I do not want to leave you, Sarah said, though she knew he was right. I do not want you to leave either, but I want you to do this important work even more, and you will come back. We will be here, waiting for you, proud of you. So in September of 1895, Sarah took the train to California, leaving her family for the first time since she had married. The journey was long and strange. The landscape changing from the mountains and plains she knew to valleys and coastal regions that seemed almost foreign. But when she arrived at the university and saw the eager faces of the students, when she began to teach and demonstrate and share everything she had learned, she understood why she had come. She spent 3 months in California, lecturing, writing, and working with students who were hungry for her knowledge. She helped establish protocols for humane animal handling that would be taught to future generations. She made connections with professors and researchers who were beginning to study animal behavior and psychology in scientific ways. She felt herself growing and expanding, her understanding deepening, as she was forced to articulate and explain principles she had always known intuitively, but she missed her family desperately. She wrote letters nearly every day, and James's responses came regularly, full of news about the children and the horses and how much they all missed her. Young Thomas wrote telling her about the difficult Mustang he had successfully trained. The twins sent drawings of horses and flowers and the whole family together. Even little John, with James's help, sent messages in his careful printing. When Sarah finally returned to Montana in December, stepping off the train in Helena with snow falling gently around her, she spotted James immediately. He was scanning the crowd, and when his eyes found hers, his whole face lit up. He pushed through the people to reach her, pulling her into his arms and holding her so tight she could barely breathe. I missed you, he said into her hair. God, Sarah, I missed you so much. I missed you too, every single day. The children were waiting at the ranch with Sarah's father's old ranch foreman and his wife, who had been helping James manage both the household and the work. When Sarah walked through the door, she was nearly knocked over by the force of her children's embrace. The twins, now nearly 10, clung to her waist. John, at 5, buried his face in her skirt, and Thomas, almost 15 and trying to be grown up, still could not help the tears that spilled down his cheeks when he hugged his mother. That night, after the children were finally settled and the house was quiet, Sarah and James lay in their bed, wrapped around each other, reconnecting after the long separation. "Tell me everything," James said. "I want to know every detail." Sarah told him about the lectures, the students, the professors, the plans she had helped develop. She told him about the strange feeling of being celebrated and recognized, of having her work validated by people she had never met. She told him about the homesickness that had plagued her, the way she had counted down the days until she could return. "But it was worth it," she concluded. "What we are doing here, James, it is going to become the standard. In universities, in agricultural programs, in training manuals, the way we work with horses is going to be taught as the right way, not the strange way. We are changing things." "You are changing things," James corrected. "I am just your willing student." "No, we are changing things together. I could not have done any of this without you. You gave me partnership and support and love. You made me brave enough to think I could influence people beyond our ranch." James kissed her forehead. "We make a good team, you and I." "The best team," Sarah agreed. The turn of the century brought both celebration and reflection. On the first day of 1900, Sarah stood on her porch looking out at the ranch that had been her home for nearly 20 years. So much had changed since she had arrived as a young woman of 22. The territory had become a state. Towns had grown. The railroad had brought connection and commerce. The wild herds of Mustangs had dwindled, though they still ran in the more remote areas. But the most significant change was in how people treated horses. Sarah's methods had spread far beyond Montana. Ranchers across the West were adopting gentler training techniques. The women she had taught had gone on to teach others, creating a network of humane horsewomen. The book she had written had been reprinted multiple times. Universities were incorporating her principles into their curricula. Young Thomas had married the previous summer, a lovely young woman from Helena named Elizabeth who shared his passion for horses. They lived in a house James had built for them on the far side of the ranch property. And Thomas had taken over much of the day-to-day training work, allowing Sarah and James to focus on teaching and consulting. The twins, now nearly 15, were talking about starting their own training business, perhaps traveling to other ranches to offer their services. They had their mother's determination and their father's patient temperament, and Sarah had no doubt they would succeed at whatever they attempted. John at 10 was still deciding what he wanted to do with his life, but he had a gift for drawing and painting horses that was truly remarkable. Sarah encouraged this artistic inclination, believing there were many ways to serve and honor the animals they all loved. James was now 43, his hair more silver than dark, his face weathered by years in the sun, but still strong, still steady, still the man Sarah loved with all her heart. They had built a good life together, a meaningful life, one that extended far beyond their own happiness to touch countless horses and people. One spring morning in 1901, Sarah was working in the large corral with a young mare when a familiar sound made her look up. A wagon was approaching, and even from a distance Sarah recognized the poor condition of the horses pulling it. Her stomach sank. Clayton Morse climbed down from the wagon looking older and meaner than the last time she had seen him, nearly 20 years ago. He approached the corral where Sarah stood, and she braced herself for confrontation. "I heard you are buying horses," Morse said without preamble. "We train horses. We occasionally purchase them if they meet our standards." Morse jerked his thumb toward his wagon team. "These two work fine. I want to sell them." Sarah walked to the fence, studying the horses closely. They were in even worse condition than the animals Morse had brought before, thin and scarred, their spirits clearly broken. She felt rage build in her chest, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "I will buy them, but I will not pay you what healthy horses are worth. I will pay you what these starved, abused animals are worth, which is essentially the cost of the meat on their bones." Morse's face went red. "These are working horses. These are victims of cruelty. I will give you $20 for both of them. Take it or leave it. $20, I paid 5 times that for each of them. Then you should have taken better care of your investment. Sarah met his eyes steadily. $20, and you are never to bring an animal onto this property again. If I hear of you mistreating animals in the future, I will make sure every rancher and buyer in Montana knows exactly what kind of man you are. Morse sputtered with fury, but he was also clearly desperate for money. Finally, he spat in the dust and nodded. Fine, $20. Sarah paid him from the cash she kept in the barn office, and Morse left in a fury, walking away on foot. Sarah immediately began unhitching the horses, speaking softly to them, her heart breaking at their condition. James appeared from the barn, alerted by the commotion. He took in the situation at a glance and came to help. Together they led the horses to the barn, where they could assess their condition and begin the slow process of rehabilitation. These two are in bad shape, James said quietly, running his hands over ribs that showed too clearly beneath dull coats. I know, but we will help them. We will give them the life they should have had all along. It took months, but with patient care, good food, and gentle handling, the two horses gradually recovered. The mare, whom Sarah named Hope, regained her weight and her spirit, becoming a sweet, willing partner in light work around the ranch. The gelding called Chance took longer to trust, but eventually he too learned that not all humans brought pain. Watching them flourish, seeing them transformed from broken, frightened animals into healthy, happy horses, reaffirmed everything Sarah believed about the power of patience and trust. It also reminded her that the work was never finished. There would always be horses who needed help, people who needed education, hearts and minds that needed changing. Young Thomas and Elizabeth welcomed their first child in 1902, a daughter they named Sarah. Holding her tiny granddaughter, Sarah felt the circle of life turn in a way that was both humbling and joyful. This little girl would grow up in a world where horses were treated better because of the work Sarah had done, the changes she had fought for. That felt like the most important legacy she could leave. The twins did indeed start their own training business, traveling throughout Montana and Wyoming offering their services. They became well known for their skill and their no-nonsense approach to teaching others. They wrote to their parents regularly, sharing their adventures and their successes. John discovered that his gift for art could serve horses in unexpected ways. He began creating detailed anatomical drawings that helped people understand horse physiology, which in turn helped them understand how to care for their animals better. His work was published in agricultural journals and training manuals, another branch of the family's influence spreading across the West. Sarah continued to teach, to write, to consult. She was invited to speak at agricultural fairs, ranching conferences, and women's organizations. She always accepted, seeing each invitation as another opportunity to spread the message that strength and gentleness could coexist, that patience was not weakness, that trust was the foundation of all meaningful relationships, whether between humans or between humans and animals. James remained her constant partner through all of it. He managed the ranch, trained horses, supported Sarah's work, and provided the steady, loving presence that made everything else possible. Their love had grown deeper over the years, worn smooth by shared experience, strengthened by weathering storms together. One evening in 1905, as they celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner alone, James took Sarah's hand across the table. "Do you remember that first day?" he asked, a question he had posed many times over the years. "When you interrupted my work with Shadow," Sarah replied, smiling. "I will never forget it. I was so skeptical. I thought you were wasting your time sitting in the dust with a wild horse. And now? Now I know that you were doing the most important work in the world. You were building trust. You were showing that another way was possible. You were being brave enough to be different." James lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her fingers gently. "You changed my life that day, Sarah. You changed how I saw everything. You made me understand that the strongest thing a person can do is be gentle. The most powerful thing a person can do is be patient. The most courageous thing a person can do is trust." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You taught me things too, James. You taught me that I did not have to be alone in my work. You taught me that partnership makes everything better. You taught me that love is not a distraction from purpose. It is the thing that makes purpose meaningful. They sat together in the candlelight, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, who had built a life of meaning and impact and deep, abiding love. Outside, the ranch was quiet. The horses settled for the night. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across Montana, living their own lives, carrying forward the lessons they had learned. Sarah thought about the path that had brought her here, from Pennsylvania to Montana, from solitary horse trainer to teacher and mother and grandmother. She thought about all the horses she had helped, all the people she had taught, all the changes that had rippled out from one simple principle, that patience and trust could transform everything. I am so grateful, she said softly, for all of it, for you, for our family, for this life. It has been more than I ever imagined. It is not over yet, James reminded her with a smile. We still have years ahead of us, more horses to train, more people to teach, more time together. Then I am grateful for that too, for all the years to come. They grew old together, Sarah and James, their hair silver, their faces lined with time and weather and laughter. They watched their children raise families, watched their grandchildren grow, and eventually welcome great-grandchildren into the world. The ranch remained their home, though Thomas and his family managed most of the day-to-day operations as Sarah and James slowed down. But they never stopped working with horses entirely. Even in their 60s and 70s, they could be found in the corrals, moving slowly, but with the same patience and purpose they had always brought to their work. Young horses still responded to their gentle handling, still learned that humans could be trusted, still discovered that there was another way to live beyond fear. Sarah wrote several more books over the years, each one building on the principles she had established in her first publication. Her work was translated into multiple languages, reaching far beyond the American West to influence how horses were treated around the world. She received recognition and awards, though she always insisted that James be acknowledged as her equal partner in developing their methods. In 1920, when Sarah was 60, the nation celebrated the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. Sarah cast her first ballot with pride, thinking of all the women she had taught over the years, all the women who had taken her lessons and used them to build independent lives, to establish their own businesses, to prove that women could do work that had once been reserved for men. She thought often of that first women's training program in 1883, of how revolutionary it had seemed to teach women that they could work with horses using methods that valued intelligence over brute strength. Those women had gone on to teach others, and those others had taught still more, creating a lineage of empowered, skilled horsewomen that stretched across generations. James remained healthy and strong well into his 70s, still riding, still working, still the steady presence he had always been. But in the winter of 1922, he caught pneumonia, and despite the best efforts of doctors, he did not recover. He died on a cold February morning holding Sarah's hand, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Sarah's grief was profound and all-consuming. James had been her partner for 40 years, her best friend, her truest love. The ranch felt empty without him, the work meaningless. She wandered through the days in a fog, unable to find her footing, unable to imagine continuing without him. It was Thomas, her son, who helped her find her way back. He brought a young, frightened Mustang to her, a horse that flinched from every touch, that had been mishandled and needed the kind of patient rehabilitation Sarah had specialized in for so many years. "He needs you, Mother," Thomas said gently, "and I think maybe you need him." Sarah looked at the horse, saw the fear and the pain and the desperate hope in his eyes, and felt something stir in her chest. Purpose. That was what James would want her to feel. He would not want her to give up, to let grief consume her. He would want her to continue the work they had built together, to honor his memory by living fully, by continuing to help horses and teach people. She began working with the Mustang, whom she named James in honor of the man she had lost. Slowly, day by day, she found her way back to herself, too. The grief remained, but it was joined by gratitude for the years they had shared, for the life they had built, for the love that had sustained them both. Sarah continued to work and teach for several more years, though at a slower pace. She became a revered figure in the world of horse training, the grandmother of gentle methods, the woman who had changed how an entire industry approached its work. People came from around the world to meet her, to learn from her, to thank her for what she had given them. In the spring of 1928, at the age of 68, Sarah decided it was time to write one final book. This one would be different from the others, not a training manual, but a memoir, the story of her life and her work, and the great love that had made it all possible. She worked on it through the summer and fall, writing in the mornings in the house she had shared with James, surrounded by memories. The book, which she titled Teach Me Your Way, A Life Built on Patience, Trust, and Love, was published in 1929. It became her most successful work, not because of the training techniques it described, but because of the love story at its heart. Readers were captivated by the tale of the young woman training wild Mustangs and the cowboy who had asked to learn her way, who had become her partner and her love, and the father of her children. The book's final chapter was written from the corral where Sarah had first met James, where Shadow had stood all those years ago. Sarah wrote about the full circle of life, about how the lessons she had learned with horses had taught her how to love, how to trust, how to be patient with the slow unfolding of a meaningful life. She wrote, "James once told me that the strongest thing a person can do is be gentle. I have spent my life proving that truth with horses and with people. But the greatest gift of gentleness was what it brought into my life. It brought James. It brought our children. It brought a legacy of changed hearts and transformed relationships. When that wild Mustang met my eyes across the corral so many years ago, I thought I was teaching him, but I was also learning. I was learning that trust has to be earned, that patience is always rewarded, that love grows from the seeds of respect and time. James saw me doing that work and said, 'Teach me your way.' In teaching him, I learned more than I could have imagined. We taught each other. We built something together that neither of us could have built alone. That, I think, is what love truly is. Not just feeling, but partnership. Not just passion, but purpose. Not just two people together, but two people making each other better, stronger, more fully themselves. The wild Mustangs taught me patience. James taught me that patience could become love. Together we taught others that another way was possible. That is the legacy I hope to leave. Not just changed methods for training horses, but changed hearts that understand the power of gentleness, the strength of patience, and the transformative nature of trust. Sarah lived for several more years, dying peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1933 at the age of 73. She was buried on the hillside next to James, overlooking the ranch they had built together, with a view of the corrals where so many horses had learned to trust and so many people had learned to be gentle. Her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren continued the work, carrying forward the methods and the philosophy that Sarah and James had pioneered. The ranch remained in the family, a living testament to the power of patience and trust. Visitors still came from around the world to learn, to see where it all began, to stand in the corral where a young woman once stood with a wild Mustang and changed the course of history. The story of Sarah Whitmore Harding and James Harding became legendary in the world of horse training. They were remembered not just for their revolutionary methods, but for the love story that had made those methods possible. They were remembered for showing that strength and gentleness could coexist, that patience was a form of power, that trust was the foundation of all meaningful work. And in corrals and ranches and training facilities across the world, people still taught horses using the principles Sarah and James had established. They stood quietly with nervous animals. They waited without expectation. They earned trust through consistency and kindness. They proved over and over again that the way of patience and trust was not just effective, but transformative. The Mustangs still ran wild in some parts of the West, though their numbers were fewer than in Sarah's youth. But the ones who were captured, who were brought in for training, had a much better fate than their ancestors had known. They were met by trainers who understood Sarah's principles, who saw them not as animals to be broken, but as partners to be earned. The legacy lived on, spreading far beyond one woman and one ranch in Montana. It lived in every gentle touch, every patient wait, every moment of trust earned between human and horse. It lived in the love story of two people who had found each other and built something extraordinary together. It lived in the simple, powerful truth that Sarah had spent her life teaching, that the strongest thing we can do is be gentle. The most powerful thing we can do is be patient. And the most transformative thing we can do is trust. And so the story ended, but also continued, as all great stories do. In the wind that blew across the Montana plains, in the dust of the corrals, in the eyes of horses who looked at humans without fear, Sarah and James lived on. Their love, their work, their legacy remained, a testament to what two people could build when they committed to patience, to trust, and to each other. The wild Mustangs had brought them together, the work had bound them, the love had sustained them, and the impact of what they created together would ripple forward through time, touching lives and changing hearts for generations to come, all because a cowboy once watched a woman work with a wild horse and had the wisdom to say, "Teach me your way."